So
really hide everything.
we go fast. Show video panel. No, should be fine.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Grasp on Robotics seminar series. My name is Michael Posa, and I'm the faculty host for today. Quick reminder, previous talks are on YouTube and on the Grasp Lab website. And if you're joining via Zoom, you can ask questions via the Q&A system in the Zoom webinar. We have two student panelists, both PhD students here at Grasp, Bibi Bianchini and Leon Kim, who are going to handle Q&A at the end of the session. Okay. For today, it is my great pleasure to have Jeannette Bohg with us. Jeannette is an assistant professor at Stanford University in computer science. She did her PhD at KTH, and I've been practicing with Danica Kragic at KTH. Has done a number of things since then, including spending some time at Max Planck Institute, where she was a research scientist and then also a group leader. Jeannette has won a number of awards, paper awards, and so on. I think the two most exciting are kind of the two big awards that the robotics community gives out to junior faculty. So both the IEEE RIS Early Career Award and the Robotic Science and Systems Early Career Award. It sort of goes without saying, Jeannette as a leader in the field, a real star across a number of different disciplines. I know her most from her work on manipulation, where it's touched on a whole number of different areas, from learning to vision to using tactile sensing. So really excited to have Jeannette here with us today and to learn more about what she's been up to recently.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, thanks, Michael, for the really nice introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talk today about kind of the newest thing we've been up to in my lab. And specifically, I'm really interested in long horizon plans recently. And so what is a long horizon plan? So imagine, for example, that you're asking a robot to prepare a meal in this really beautiful kitchen, right? And if the robot is given such a high-level goal of preparing some kind of meal, it has to do a bunch of steps to get there, right? It's like a really long process, might take hours, depending on what you're asking for. And it really doesn't seem feasible to plan joint motor commands for that long horizon task, right? That seems a little bit too computationally infeasible, let's say. And so what could be helpful here to make this long horizon planning and execution of this plan somehow feasible is to actually abstract away some of these low-level details of the environment, for example, such as the poses and the mesh geometries of these objects, and operate somehow also at the level of symbols instead. So, for example, to describe that this pot is on the stove here, for example, or that this microwave is actually closed. And using symbols to plan over long horizons is called task planning. And it has its roots in early AI, where researchers studied how to give robots the ability to reason through symbols and logical reasoning. But the thing is, I'm assuming like all of you are working with robots, so you know that actually planning over symbols is not enough to actually perform finally this task in the real world. So consider this example where the robot has to take this cup from the dishwasher and and the goal is for it to place it into the shelf. Task planning, if you run it by itself, it might come up with a simple plan, a simple two-step solution, which is picking and then placing. Where first the robot picks up the mug and second places it into that cabinet. But if the robot were to blindly execute this particular plan, it might actually not succeed, as you see here, right? Like if because the cup is upside down, it grabs it from the bottom, and then if it were to place it in a cabinet, it's probably going to collide with the cabinet. Okay, so that's not great. So this is an example of just a simple example where that illustrates how you cannot ignore the geometric details of this manipulation problem. And so it's really important to take that into account. And so this really motivates some way to integrate task planning with motion planning, where you will basically need to plan a motion trajectory that will successfully execute the sequence of actions that is proposed by the task planner. But of course, as in this case, in some cases, this motion planner may not actually be able to find feasible motion for this task plan. And so the task plan then, if it realizes, oh, this is actually not feasible, may need to replan and come up with a more complex sequence. For example, picking up this cup, then placing it first, regrasping it, and then placing it into the cabinet. And so this integration of task and motion planning is really also called task and motion planning. Yeah, ingenious name. But anyway, so this basically motivates actually integrating that. And there has been a lot of work in this area. And so these are two videos that illustrate recent TAMP algorithms that have been proposed, so state-of-the-art algorithms that can perform long horizon tasks, like grabbing an object outside of the workspace of the robot here on the left, or performing food in the kitchen, right? Like this task that we talked about is a slightly less beautiful kitchen that this robot operates in. Okay, so these TAMP methods, they can actually find very impressive solution to these long horizon planning problems, but it's extremely computationally expensive, right? So that's really the catch with these methods. So the TAMP solutions here that you see in these videos, they take several minutes to solve. And as a result, previous TAMP methods like these ones are often limited to simulated environments or to very highly controlled scenarios, like small scenarios, where there are no moving objects or external disturbances. And so the question that we were asking in my lab is really, okay, how can we bring these cool algorithms that are actually great, that can solve these long horizon tasks? How can we bring them to the real world that has all of these dynamics and disturbances in them? And so the focus of this talk is that question. How do we bring these algorithms to the real world? And this diagram, it tries to show what we think are kind of the crucial system components of a robotic stacks for performing these long horizon tasks in the real world. And a lot of previous work in TAMP basically focuses on these first two boxes over there, right? Like how to integrate the task and the motion planner. But really, if you want to bring TAMP to the real world, you have to think about the other bits as well. The reactive control and also perception, of course, and how it all like interlinks with each other. Okay, so one work that we tried to do basically first in that space back in 2020 was to look at how can we take these TAMP algorithms that you've seen before that ran in simulation on the small kitchen domain, how can we bring it to the scenarios where objects are actually moving around all the time. And so there has to be potentially be some replanning happening or at least some reaction. And so this is kind of the first work that we did, which I will cover here like pretty high level because just to motivate kind of what is going on in that space at this moment. And then I will basically in this talk fill in all the other boxes of this diagram that I showed before. But okay, so let's revisit this problem again of manipulating an object outside of its the robot workspace. So in this environment, there are four objects here: a table, a large box, a small box, and an L-shaped hook. And now let's say we want the robot to place the small box onto this large box. And the small box is outside of the workspace. And so task planning really uses symbolic reasoning to come up with a sequence of action to accomplish this goal. And so the plan here would be to first pick up the hook, use the hook to pull the small box closer, place the hook on the table, and then pick up the small box and finally place it on the large box. And so now motion planning then plans the geometric details such as where to grasp the hook, how close to pull the small box, and so on, that we have so that the robot has a concrete trajectory to execute later on. And so to solve this TAMP problem, we, in our approach, we built off this logic geometric programming approach from Marc Toussaint, which combines PDDL planning with nonlinear trajectory optimization. And like most other TAMP methods, including the one that you've seen before, logic geometric programming produces joint space trajectory for these robots. And the problem with that is that they're only valid as long as the environment is static and perception and control are highly accurate. And if something in the environment changes, such as the position of these objects, then the joint configuration for grasping, for example, the small box is no longer valid. And the robot would have to stop, replan for several minutes. And this is what makes it really impractical to use TAMP in the real world. Okay, so the problem is computing trajectories in joint space leads to these rigid plans. And what we contributed here is a TAMP framework that optimizes trajectories over object-centric Cartesian frames rather than joint configuration. And so the plans produced by this framework remain valid even if the objects are moving. And so I'm going to show you here a video where the student who did this work is actually perturbing all the objects, and the plans that are executed by reactive controllers that adapt to the changes in real time. So the task plan that locks, or the task and motion plan that links these object-centric frames to the objects, it stays exactly the same. But because everything is defined relative to the objects, as long as we can keep track of them, we can actually adopt the trajectories. Okay, so this is how this looks like here. The robot is being pushed around, the objects are being moved around, and yet the robot can still react to these and finally succeed at this task of placing this box onto the small box onto the big box. And all of this is in real time. I know this is also simulation, but this also works in real time. Another basically benefit of this is that that optimizing over these relative pose variables can be much quicker than optimizing over joint configuration. So this is this Tower of Hanoi problem that shows how relative pose variables allow us to plan over a really long horizon through the decoupling of actions that relative pose variables bring. And without this decoupling, this Tower of Hanoi problem would be extremely difficult to solve because the placement of the blocks early have really big influence on the placement of the blocks later on. Okay, and so here is the same plan basically executed on a real robot. So here we track the object with some model-based vision method and a bunch of markers. So the perception part here is not like super interesting maybe, but it's good to know that the perception actually does have quite some errors here as well. And yet this robot can deal with, first of all, these inaccuracies. And also you see Toki moving around, again, all these boxes and perturbing the robot as well. Yeah, so this work was basically a step into making, let me see actually if I can close this window. So, okay, so this work was basically a step towards making task and motion planning, bringing it to the real world by allowing it to react to dynamic changes in the environment. And so the main idea was basically something that came up in prior work, right? We wanted to have symbolic planning create an action skeleton that translates into this constrained motion optimization problem. And the contribution was this reformulated trajectory optimization to optimize relative Cartesian frame, which I haven't even shown you the exact formulation, but yeah, it's maybe not so important for the entire message of the talk. But yeah, it allowed task and motion planning in dynamic environments, and feel free to check out this work as well. Okay, so now we can now get around the computational cost of TAMP and apply it to these dynamic and real-world environments, because we don't have to rerun the TAMP problem if something changes in the environment, at least to a certain extent. So the thing is, though, with relative pose variables, it could still take anywhere from a second to a minute to come up with this first TAMP plan. But again, once you have it, now it's actually still valid when stuff moves around. Okay, so one thing is that even though these reactive controllers that you've seen here are executing the plan, we would still want to continue running TAMP, so task and motion planning, in the background to output potentially new TAMP plans or task plans whenever we can to handle larger changes in the environment. And so what do you need for that? So if you want to run a task planner in closed loop, we need a way to perceive the symbolic state of the environment, and such as whether the block is in the hand or on the table, so you can pass this information to the task planner and replan accordingly. And so for this work, which I'm also not going to elaborate on, I just want to show it here to show how we can make everything reactive in this task planning framework. We basically found a way that addresses the difficulty of learning symbolic state perception system, especially in terms of the labels that we need for this. So here we found a way to ground predicates through description of the action domains that we are considering. And so what we did here is that we exploit that manipulation actions, that we know how they change the symbolic state. For example, we used as a proof of concept this particular video data set that has 172 different types of actions executed by humans. It contains 200,000, more than 200,000 videos of humans like those that you see here performing these 172 or 174 common manipulation actions. And so each of these videos is annotated with the action that is performed in the video. And that's really the only label that we need here, in addition to a PDDL domain for each of these actions that contain the necessary pre and post condition. And so exploiting this, we can do a cheap labeling of these videos to actually get training data for predicates that we care about in a manipulation problem. And so the output of this work is that we can look at videos like this one from this 20 billion something data set, and actually look at the action and check whether the pre and post conditions that you see here outlined are actually fulfilled or not for this action of closing the book. So here is, and again, this works in real time as well. Here's a bit of a more interesting problem where, again, we have a video of a person doing this task, and we can basically see for this action of poking a flashlight when the pre and when the post conditions are actually fulfilled. Okay, so now if we can do that, we can also give that ability to a robot and to the task planner that it's using to trigger potential replanning that it might need to do. And so this is what I'm going to show next, how we integrated this. So for this examples, we basically take these predicate classifiers that we trained in that way using these videos for closed loop task planning. And so we apply these predicate classifiers directly to this robot environment. And so here we set up a task planning scenario where the goal for the robot is to clear the fruit off the table surface. And this is what this logical formula above the picture actually states. Okay, so the task planner, given this initial state, basically comes up with a sequence of action to satisfy this goal. And then the classifier or the predicate classifier parse this image and predict the symbolic state in real time so that the robot can respond in real time and replan immediately. And so here, again, you have Toki doing his usual thing of like annoying the robot and perturbing the state so that the robot has to continuously replan. This is just like another example of introducing reactivity into this, what was previously a very rigid framework of task and motion planning that, again, takes sometimes up to minutes to replan. Okay, So just to summarize this work, which again, I've only touched on very high level, this is called grounding predicates through actions. And the main idea was to exploit that action changed the symbolic state of the environment in a known way, which is something we have to actually define, and use that for cheap proposition labeling of video demonstrations. And there's a technical contribution here that is actually formulating this framework for obtaining these partial state labels for video demonstrations and training predicate classifiers. And as a result, we have 37 different predicate classifiers that are relevant to 172 different actions that can be used for closed-loop task planning. Okay, so this was pretty high level because I wanted to show you that what is possible right now if you follow a traditional TAMP paradigm that uses symbolic planning and an optimization-based planner, how you can embed reactivity into it, right? And these were like two works where we basically showed that. So that's really nice, but we are still have the burden of, especially for this object-centric TAMP work, to actually define, in this particular case, all the constraints for all of the different skills that we want a robot to do. So we have to, first of all, define all these PDDL domains for our task, right? And have to do that by hand. And we also have to formulate this trajectory optimization problem and really define all the constraints for all of these different pick, place, pull actions, which can be really hard to scale up to, for example, 172 different actions, right? To do that by hand. And so this really brought us to the question of like, how can we even further scale this up to maybe these 172 different actions that we have in this data set of 20 billion something. And so as a first step, what we worked on was to try to replace our hand-designed reactive controllers with learned policies that don't require privileged information, like exact information of where all the objects are and relatively precise tracking. And we don't need to necessarily, hopefully, know all the object meshes and poses and can maybe operate on more raw sensory data instead. So that's the work basically that I'm gonna go into now, where we try to basically define or learn policies. And so the way we frame this problem is as having a robot learn something we call manipulation concepts. And these manipulation concepts, you can see them as a mental representation of verbs in a particular sentence. And so given an initial scene image, when we send various instructions in natural language, like push something behind something or push something into something, we want our robot to generate motion trajectories, which is the output here on the right, to accomplish these tasks. And so another way on how to think about manipulation concepts, you could also think of it as a multitask policy as well, right? That takes as input a goal expressed in natural language and an initial scene image. Okay, so to achieve this, we constructed an embedding space that associates task instructions in natural language and the scene image with motion trajectories. And so constructing this embedding space offers several benefits. So first, we can specify a manipulation task in language instead of goal images, which at this point in time in 2020, when we published this work, was actually the predominant approach. And describing task in natural language seems much simpler than providing a solution image already. So second, we can obtain this multitask policy to represent diverse manipulation skills all in one, such as open something or close something. And hopefully we could also generalize over a diverse set of manipulation tasks. Because we are training on so many, we might even be able to interpolate between them and generalize to new instructions that are similar to the first ones. Okay, So now, how do we train a robot to output, to basically, how do we train these manipulation concepts and to get a robot to output trajectories that accomplish these tasks? And so our approach is to use learning from visual demonstrations. It allows us to avoid reward engineering that you need to use for, if you do like a pure RL approach, or kinesthetic teaching, or teleoperation, all things that can become really tedious and very time consuming and difficult to scale up with many different tasks. And so as a source of our video demonstrations from people, we actually, again, use this 20 billion something data set that contains around, again, 200K video clips with 172 different action classes. And each of these clips is annotated with a task description in natural language, such as putting something on a surface, moving something up, and so on. And so again, like imagine having to do all of these tasks, record all of these 200,000 videos with an actual robot for all of these diverse tasks and all of these diverse objects, right? Like it's something that is you can do if you are at Google, basically. Maybe not even there; they haven't finished that yet. Okay, so this is just like these video data sets are really cool because they give you such great diversity. Maybe one thing I wanted to mention again on that previous work where we learned the predicates, it's kind of great that we have these video data sets that have this visual diversity. We use our robot description in PDDL to then train predicates that don't have to be trained on simulated data. We can directly use these real-world videos. So there's no sim-to-real gap that for the predicate classifiers we have to actually bridge. So that was really nice in this previous work. But here, we actually have a problem with that domain gap between human video demonstrations and what a robot does, right? So there's really a huge domain gap between here, in this case, the simulation of the robot, right? But even if it was a real robot, there would still be a huge domain gap. So between the robot and the humans, and you see here these close something examples that are in this video data sets, and they are really different. First of all, from each other, but also from the robot simulation. And so if we want to learn from these videos, we need to be able, with our visual demonstration method, to handle all these different backgrounds, different viewpoints, different objects, and so on. And so our core idea on how we address that is that we actually use a video activity classifier to evaluate robot trajectories. And this video activity classifier is first trained to classify the action labels of these human videos first on this 20 billion something data set. And then we use that same activity classifier that is trained to classify the human videos on the robot videos as well. And the score represents how confident this video classifier is on basically whether the robot video shows the execution of this particular action. And this score, in our approach, it will provide the reward to an RL algorithm that learns a policy for this action. Okay, so how does that exactly look like? A little bit more, let's look a little bit more deeply at this architecture. So again, we have as input to this model a natural language instruction and an initial scene image. You see here, and this was in 2020, so we used a BERT. We used the BERT model back then, and we use ResNet, and then we concatenate these features to provide a semantic context. Okay, and then in the middle, we have what we call this policy generation network that outputs an entire motion trajectory specified as a goalpost and a series of forces, of force terms that perturb the otherwise straight line trajectory. So if you're familiar with dynamic movement primitives, for example, you could think of them as something like this, right? It's a way to encode a complex trajectory with just very few parameters, essentially. So this is what we output here. And then next, we execute this entire motion trajectory open loop in simulation and render it to get a video out. And now this video is sent to this activity classifier that is trained on human videos to get a score of how well, that basically quantifies how well the robot actually looks like executing this action. And we use that as a reward. And then we run reinforcement learning to update the parameters of the motion trajectory network to maximize this reward. And yeah, if there's something unclear, by the way, you should totally ask a question as well. Yes. Yes. We actually didn't train it ourselves. We took like one that was existing and did like state of the art, I think, at that time on this particular data set, on that challenge that was defined on this data set. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So when my student suggested this, I said, this is never going to work because of this domain gap. And so to my personal surprise, and I think maybe not to the students, I don't know, but to my personal surprise, it did generalize. And I think, so we also wondered why that is. And so we did an experiment in the paper where we, instead of using an entire video as input to this activity classifier, we used only a single image that was more towards the end of this, of this robot video, and had that one be classified for activity, and that did not work as well as reward in this particular framework that we have here. And so we think the reason why there is generalization from these human videos to robot videos is because it's actually a video that is taken as input, and so there has to be some understanding about the progress of what is happening over the entire sequence of a video to understand what the action actually is. And I know there are also results in computer vision right now that that look at, that I think in Fei-Fei's group, actually, they had a work that is like revisiting video activity classifiers, and they find that it's actually important to pick a particular frame, right, in the sequence. So for our ablation experiments, we basically picked like one particular frame that is more towards the end, and that didn't work as well, right? And so it might be that this activity classifier that we reused here, it paid attention maybe to one particular frame, but that one seemed to have generalized between people videos and robot videos. Yeah, so that's kind of what we think is happening here. Yeah, there was another question.
That's a great idea. Classifier, but that classifier is becoming invariant for too many things. Because let's say for the drawer, can be the forces can be in any direction.
Yes.
Or the drawer in any pole. And the last part of the left pipeline does not seem to be invariant at all, unless within 1 million is not.
Yes. Yes. So, okay. So we did train this robot to be at least to perform well on any kind of orientation of this drawer, for example. But yes, that means we have to cover that space with images, right? Like that we sample with all of these different, or with scenarios that we sample with different drawer poses. But it's true that we also didn't have for the robot to actually vary the specific drawer. So that is like a problem we haven't looked into. And I'm actually very interested to think about that scene representation where we right now for this particular work, so we have some other work later where we use something different. But a scene image for me personally also doesn't seem like a good input for a policy, right? Like what is about all that 3D information? Do we maybe want to have something more object-centric, right? So these are all very interesting questions that I'm actively thinking, or we are actively thinking about. But yeah, here we just threw a ton of data at it. It's in simulation, so that's why we could do it. Other questions? Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't.
So how can you address
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure I understood the question. Let me rephrase the question in the way I understood it. So you're also concerned about the gap between the human demonstration videos that look very different from the videos that are the robot basically produces to be also fed into that same classifier, right? Okay, so yeah, so as I said, again, like my expectation was that this will never work. That's what I told the student, and he taught me wrong, right? He proved me wrong. And our hypothesis is the reason why this works is because this activity classifier takes an entire video into account, and the dynamics in a video that show opening something, those actually transfer over to the demonstration or the video that the robot does as well, right? Like the single frames, they have a very different appearance, but if you consider the dynamics over time, they should actually be very similar, right? Like how does the optical, let's say, like how does the optical flow like for opening something? That is probably going to be very similar between human videos and robot videos. There was another question?
Yeah. I just had a little bit. So in something that asks to define as close something, like not close drawer, for example. So
yeah.
Classifier that means close something.
I think we actually feed in the entire instructions like it's shown here. Yeah. With where the something is replaced with the object as well.
So you have classifiers that are specialized to the combination of verb and object.
No, the classifier is only on closing, but the instruction are specific to the object, right? Yeah. 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 Like these ones, right? Closing a bottle, blah, blah, blah. All of these different things, and they have extremely different actions, right? And so we, in our robotic scenario, we only have the draw, right? So that's like an open question. Like, okay, with this idea, how can we, is there a way to scale up learning on all of these different objects as well, right? That could also be closed in this case, right? Yeah, that's definitely something that we haven't done, and it's an interesting question. Yes, on all of them. On all of them. So literally we actually didn't train it ourselves. We took one that was trained for us, you know, on this data set and performed well on this data set. Yes.
Just almost in the similar fashion. I noticed in the movies there are pictures, there are movies of the coffee sloshing around in the cup, and I imagine there are also the orange rolling around on the table. How far away is the paradigm that you thought to be able to encompass, you know, something the dynamics of the world very far away?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, there's so. I mean, we're very far away. That's the easy answer to that one. That's a short one. So I think this idea though of using these videos or maybe classifiers like the ones that have been learned from videos, that since that work has actually been moved forward and has shown that it can be very useful for learning representations of visual data that are then input to a policy that could do more complex manipulation tasks on a real robot. But I think the bottleneck is actually the data for these types of approaches that use a policy. The bottleneck is actually the data that you then finally get from the real robot, right? Not the videos anymore. The videos give you like this visual representation, like this, you know, lower dimensional representation. But in the end, you need to do it on the real robot. And here we do it in simulation, right? So we can like do however long we want to train this, but on the real world, things become hard.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Yes, and again, like we're still far, right? But that's an interesting question to ask. Like, how do you get this reactivity together with the symbolic reasoning again when you scaled up everything to learning-based methods? Okay. Okay, cool. Maybe let's. I actually don't know. How am I doing in terms of time? Oh, okay.
But I think it's usually there's a good Q&A, but here, yeah, it's just
okay. Okay. Okay, let's, so these were actually all works that I kind of covered relatively high level again. But anyway, so let's move to, put more things into this whole systems view here that I have. So now we have learned policies and, they still have limitations as we just discussed. But let's say we had a way to get these learned policies for all of these different actions. But now you see there is like a connection missing between the task planner and these learned policies, right? Like, so how do you now, how do you now sequence these learned policies? They all do like these primitive tasks, but in the end, we want to do a long horizon task with them, right? So how do we plan now with these learned policies? How can we sequence them together? And it's really not as simple as just executing these learned policies in the sequence. So let's come back to this example, right, where the robot needs to pick up the mug from the dishwasher and place it in the upright cabinet. And so we can learn now, maybe, let's say, right, like we could learn a policy that has 100% success rate at picking up objects and 100% success rate of actually placing these objects into a cabinet. But when you execute them one after the other, it still doesn't mean that they will actually, in that case, succeed, right? Just like in this example that we had here before, because there are actually these geometric dependencies. It matters how you execute the first action for how you can then possibly execute the next one, right? So it's really important to somehow plan with these. Okay, and so maybe I kind of skipped this slide. This is kind of unrelated work where people have tried to do the task planning with long horizon RL that sits on top of a bunch of primitives and kind of orchestrates these primitives, right? And so our take here is that that doesn't really scale well because all of these works here, except from the bottom right, they actually they are only trained for one long horizon task and few minor variations of this long horizon task. But if you think about it, we want a method that can solve a really large variety of long horizon tasks with a library of primitives, maybe, right? And so if you wanted to train this, if you wanted to take this approach, you would need to train a policy over this, infinitely many possible long horizon tasks, and that doesn't really scale. And again, these works also don't show that this actually scales over this. Okay, so so the strength of task planning is really that it can immediately generalize to any long horizon task if you define this domain, right? By reasoning about the logic of action pre and post conditions. And so we want to take advantage of this generalization ability. And the task planner will now tell us which actions to perform and in what order. And what's missing is really a way to do planning with these learned policies now to handle these geometric constraints. So what we propose is to, instead of doing this long horizon RL learning, we do sampling-based trajectory optimization with policy value function to realize task planning with these learned policies. Okay, so let's look at this. So again, what we consider as the problem is that we are given a library of independently trained primitives or skills. So they are trained to be good at picking any object, or they are good at placing any object. And so we have a library of those. And we also assume we have this task planner that gives us a sequence of primitives to be executed. And that is what we want to basically execute here. Okay, so now let's come back to our, the hook reach example that you've already seen before. So this task involves picking up a hook from the table to pull an object closer that is beyond, initially beyond the robot's reach. And the challenge here is that if you greedily execute these primitives in the sequence or in that sequence that is proposed, it may fail due to these geometric action dependencies, because it matters how you pick up the hook for whether you will be successful later in actually using that tool, right, like to do your task. And so that's really basically the challenge here. You have to somehow resolve these action dependencies, and succeeding at this long horizon task really requires you to reason over these long-term geometric dependencies. Okay, so the core idea that we follow here is that we cast this planning problem with learned primitives as a maximization problem over the probability of long horizon task success. And we show that this is equivalent to the product of Q functions that we have for each of these primitive policies in a task plan. Okay, so this is basically, I can even point at things. Okay, great. So this is basically the cost function where we are trying to optimize these actions given the current state. And this is, again, we show that it's equivalent to the product of Q functions that actually correspond to each of these skills that we have. And so how do we exactly do this? We solve this problem by this sampling-based motion planning. We actually use just CEM in this case to find a trajectory where the Q values of all the primitive policies in the long horizon tasks are high. And what that means is that if the earlier actions in the sequence are executed in such a way that they neglect downstream action dependencies, we expect one of these downstream Q values to be low, and hence that the overall planning objective J will be low. Okay, so what do we need? Basically, our framework has like 3 key components. First of all, we have this library of manipulation primitives up here. They're Q functions down here. And we trained all of this with, in this case, SAC. And we also need down here, dynamics model that are trained with the transition experience in the replay buffer collected over the course of training each primitive policy. And so why do we need this dynamics model? Because we need to do planning, right? Like if we execute an action, if we plan to do an action with the robot in a current state, we need to be able to predict that state forward to then test again for the next skill, like, okay, with that predicted state, which of my sampled action will finally lead me to a high expected reward as basically captured by this Q function. Okay. So, what is nice here is that you have this library of primitives. They are trained independently of the long horizon task. They are really agnostic to a long horizon task that we might want them to do. But still, in this way, we will actually be able to chain them together for arbitrary tasks. One thing in addition that we need is actually this. Here, sorry, I'm confused which mouse I'm using. Okay, one thing we need is actually this uncertainty quantification because of the way we train the policies, right? So we train the policies to be good at picking things up, but if we use that particular policy in a longer sequence, it may be exposed to states that it hasn't seen during training to be good at picking at all. And so that Q function that we trained, it might actually produce garbage when we put in a state that it hasn't seen at training because it's out of distribution. And so what we also use in addition is we use uncertainty quantification. So this is this D part here in this figure, where we basically give it a very high cost if the Q function is basically low quality. Okay, so in comparison to prior work, basically, which includes this model-based RL work or traditional TAMP methods, our work can really generalize to more long horizon tasks, and it produces plans really quickly through the use of these learned models. And also it promises better scaling to large libraries of primitives as well. And so we evaluated this in these 3 different domains. So you already have seen a lot this hook reach task. We have a constrained packing task where the robot actually needs to reason about the configuration of the objects on a confined space, and also a rearrangement push task where the robot basically needs to place an object in a particular place so that it can be then pushed under the rack in this case. So all of these domains have like a very specific set of geometric dependencies. And this is how this looks like on a view of robot, where we compared with the greedy method that just executes the methods without considering the downstream implications of it. And you see what's happening here. You've already seen how the greedy method might fail. Here's this constrained packing scenario where basically the plan is to place everything onto this rack. And you see that the greedy action results in a configuration of objects that is imperfect for this placing policy, and it doesn't know how to handle those. And so here we have this rearrangement push where in greedy, you see the object is actually being placed in sort of like a random place that prevents the robot from actually being able to push it under the rack because it's colliding with that hook in the end. Yeah, so just to summarize this work that will be presented at ICRA this year. So the problem that we considered was the sequential manipulation or solving sequential manipulation tasks that contain these geometric action dependencies, where prior work trained a set of primitives for solving very specific long horizon tasks. And so we train all the primitives independently so that we have a composable set of primitives that we can, in a library that can even be extended and solve long horizon tasks by maximizing long horizon success. Yeah, and so what we see is now we can solve these long horizon tasks that the primitives have actually not been specifically trained on. Yes.
Question
yes.
About the, I know you use a motion planner underneath the RL policy, which I think is great.
It's I would say a motion planner. It's not a motion planner in the traditional sense of trying to do collision avoidance or something like this. It actually doesn't do that.
My question is like, why doesn't the motion planner at least tell you like whether, at least in like the constraint packing thing, it should tell you that placing the yogurt on top of another thing will lead to collision, and you should at least like know it's not feasible. But okay, yeah, that clears up my question.
So it's it's not a motion planner. It's actually just a sampling based. It's just CEM basically that we use there to sample the actions A to execute that. And so for so of course motion planning has its place as well, right? Like where you could potentially reason about all of this. Over a long horizon. And this is what traditional TAMP methods do, right? So, but by using the learned policy, it's much easier to actually evaluate these functions, and the planning is actually much faster when you consider this long horizon, right? Yeah.
So the dynamics models in this case, for dynamics model go high level, but go over the primitives. Is that right?
So the dynamics models were actually on the geometric information, right? So if you were to so I'm in the current state where object the red box is at XYZ position, and I'm picking that object. Then in in the next state, it's actually going to be in the hand at XYZ position and things. So it's like really geometric, the dynamics models. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. So just in the interest maybe of time, so now we basically close this gap over there, right? Like now we have a way to take learned policies and plan with them. Again, we're actually not using the concept to robot work. So what I haven't told you is that for this particular work is we actually use a vision system that doesn't exist, which gives you some information, some object-centric information. It doesn't take an image actually into account, right? So unfortunately, something like this doesn't exist, something that works reliably well enough to actually be plugged in to yet. So I would say we haven't yet done this planning with the concept to robot policies yet. That's just a disclaimer. Okay, so now I want to come to the last work. So there's one box that we haven't yet really replaced, right? And that is the one of the task planner, where we typically, for now, have basically hand-defined, the planning domains in the symbolic space. And as you probably all know, right, there's all this interesting work that uses these large language models and a library of skills to control the robot through natural language instructions. And so you have SACAN or a follow-up work in a monologue that selects the best skill to execute by scoring available skills. So for them, a skill is actually picking up an apple, and then a different skill is picking up a banana, for example. And they select the one with the highest score, and they terminate when a done skill is done. And the follow-up work uses some, actually, I'm seeing some Stanford people and see some intermediate feedback on skill success. Okay, and then we have also code to policy on the right, which, given an instruction, generates an entire Python program, which calls APIs with predefined skills. For example, pick, pick underscore and underscore place. Okay, so of course, one problem with using these is that, if you played around with ChatGPT, for example, is that these LMMs can produce arbitrary garbage, right? Like very confidently as well. So for example, if you've seen Ani Rudna-Mayunder's example on Twitter, he had like a funny thread where he asked ChatGPT about dynamics, and it was completely wrong, but confidently so. And so what these questions are not, or what these methods are not answering, is the verification aspect of this, right? Like when you plug in an LMM, are you really going to execute this on a robot for real? I mean, probably you shouldn't, right? But it's still very attractive somehow. It's very exciting because, in a way, these in-context examples that you provide to a large language model, they are much more user-friendly to provide than, for example, writing down this PDDL domain for 172 different actions, right? Okay, so what we explored is how can we maybe do task planning with LMMs, but really verify that this task actually works. And for example, we want to do task planning again with these learned primitives, where we want to again check if these plans are actually feasible and if all these geometric dependencies actually hold. Okay. So what we call this work text to motion. And so what do we have? We assume we have a library of skills trained in the same way that you've seen before. And we have a large language model. And now we also provide this large language model with a library of predicate classifiers. So this is basically a vision system that says, is this box on the rack, or is this box in the hand, and so on. So this could be something like the grounding predicate to actions work that I've shown before. But whatever it is, the objective here is to generate a sequence of skills and optimize basically these sequence of actions A, the geometric actions that satisfy the language instructions that the user provides. And so how does that look like? So first of all, we're going to generate goal propositions with this model. So we query this large language model with this natural language instruction and the scene description. And then we're going to basically get out a series of states on the abstract level that we want to achieve given this language instruction. And then we generate a plan essentially through beam search by iterating between the following steps. So first we query an LMM for the useful skill to actually reach that goal, given also the scene description, one of them. Then we optimize a sequence of actions up to this current planning iteration using this method that I just showed you before that is called TAMPs. And then we select the skill with the highest score that comes, so product of the LMM score and this score from the TAPS work that I just showed you before that basically captures usefulness and feasibility as well. Okay, So then we terminate the search when the goal is satisfied or when it basically runs out of max steps. Okay, so now I know we are like kind of out of time, I think. So I'm just going to run through this algorithm, and then I think we are out of time. But basically, how does this work? So we have a user providing this question, right? Like, how would you put two primary colored boxes onto the rack? And the robot has some vision system that provides it with what are all the objects and what is the abstract state of the world, right? Like what object is on what other objects and so on. Then we use that to predict goal predicates. So this is what the LMM basically predicted the user wants to see. So you see these are a bunch of possibilities of how to put two primary colored boxes onto a rack. And then the algorithm, this beam search, basically works as follows. We ask the LMM for the top 5 valid action. We use basically a log likelihood to score these actions according to the goal. Then we use taps to see if we can actually geometrically do that action. And you see, okay, picking red works actually pretty well, while picking yellow doesn't work so well because it's out of the workspace in this particular scene. And then we predict forward with the dynamics model from taps, again, what is actually happening, both geometrically and then on the abstract level. We realize, okay, or the goal is not yet satisfied. And so we basically continue doing this iteration over and over again until the goal is satisfied and we get a feasible plan out that we can then execute on the robot. So again, now we have a feasible abstract plan, but we also have the grounding in this and the geometric actions as well. Okay, there are a lot of details to it, and there are a ton of limitations as well that I'm happy to talk about actually during the day. So that would be great to talk about. So here are just some examples of how this looks like with this method. And here's some comparison to the baseline as well, like SECAN or its follow-up in a monologue that is greedy and myopic. It doesn't take, it basically takes the task plan and doesn't care about any geometric dependencies. So it's going to fail in the way that you've already seen. There are lots of results that I can talk about. But yeah, just to summarize, we want to solve these geometrically complex manipulation tasks expressed by natural language instructions. And prior work has done this myopically, or just considered a plan myopically. And we generate these feasible plans that verify that a goal proposition is actually satisfied, as inferred from language instructions. And yeah, you've seen the results already. And so, okay, so now bringing back this big picture. So we have worked on each of these components with the goal of really scaling it up to many different tasks. Hopefully, I don't think, not yet, we have not yet maintained this reactivity with these learned primitives, for example. I think that is also, their perception is also a huge question. But we have all of these pieces together, and there are really interesting questions at the intersections of these as well. And there are lots of limitations also with these approaches that I'm really happy to talk about with all of you during the day. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, Jeannette. Thank you for the incredibly comprehensive talk.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, if you don't mind, I'm going to abuse my role as a panelist and try and ask the first question, which I hope will be quick. Okay.
Thank you. It will show my age, but I hope that Kostas is here. Remembering in 1980s, I had a PhD student, and you guys can go to Google and check out the paper. Bogoni, B-O-G-O-N-I, Luca Bogoni and Baici. We had a paper on functionality. And it's fascinating to me to see. Of course, we didn't talk about learning. It was not in fashion. But, we were worried, we put a lot of emphasis on perception action. So we measured and evaluated friction, stiffness, deformation of materials, and shape. So we talked about graspability, which objects are graspable, pushability, breakability. We had what is cuttable for a knife, or what is pierceable. And this really came from motivation from psychologists who talked about functionality as opposed to skills. It's fascinating how things change. So thank you.
Yeah.
But I suggest the students to really look at this old papers, because you will get some ideas how to connect the old with the new.
Yeah. I think, I'm very familiar with your work. And so I think there are lots of super interesting papers that I've read from the 80s, right, with all of you students, where I'm thinking like, these were really cool ideas and almost ahead of their time, or like they tried to do something with very crummy vision modules, for example, or very no learning, right? And I think I totally agree with you, like going back to these ideas and looking at them again, and now, basically trying them again with these new models. What can we do? Like, for example, what I find, there are lots of issues with these large language models. What I find interesting is that they have this common sense knowledge of, for example, what is cuttable versus what is not, right? So you can really use these models maybe as a prior to at least inform the robot, like, oh, this is a good thing to try or to confirm, right? What I've visually seen, oh, this looks like a cucumber, so it's probably cuttable, right? But let me try it. So one thing that I want to say is, like, you also talked about very low level functionality of skills like friction, or what is cuttable, what is graspable, what is the material of things. And these are all things that are really poor, that still work very poorly, just generally. I think that's like one of the big open questions of how to actually do the low level sensory motor skills that have to deal with the real world effects of all of this. Thank you. There are so many, like, just simulation, right? Like these super high powered simulation environments that reinforcement learning algorithms are now basically exploiting to get the data that they need, right? With their bad scalability in terms of exploration. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about the concept to robot work. I'm wondering if the policies learn to exploit sort of the visual aliasing that you get just from a 2D, image, or just the ambiguity of language to get undesirable behaviors. And I guess I'm wondering if your lab has thought about how to combat that, either through multimodal sensing, which can help disambiguate like these symbolic states. And towards the title of your talk, which is about scaling learning, like things like audio can help disambiguate like whether a drawer is like actually closed, or maybe like the first part of your group's name, which is like the interactive perception part. Like, I guess I'm just wondering like how we can do better symbolic state classification through these other avenues.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I'm really interested in how a robot can go beyond just using an RGB image, right? And actually use all the different modalities it has access to, right? It has certainly, most robots have a depth camera. Why are we only using RGB camera, right? It's like manipulation is such a spatial task. It seems kind of weird. And then, of course, the sense of touch is super important. So we are still looking at that. And we also recently looked at this, at audio understanding. And what it means to hear something. What can you infer in terms of material of the object? What does that mean for manipulation? These are like definitely all interesting questions. And so for the concept to robot work, what we exploit there are these videos, which give us this really big visual diversity that it's very hard to collect with a real robot, right? So that's what these videos give us. But what we don't get is depth, or I mean, maybe we can run a monocular depth estimation method. I don't know, but right, like it's not there. We don't have a sense of touch. We don't have the action annotation. Maybe we have sound, right? That's kind of interesting. But yeah, all of these modalities that an actual robot has, we don't get from that. And so so we are trying to think about how a robot can use these modalities, but we can't do it at the scale of data that we would get from these videos, for example. And so what we do is we think way more algorithmically when it comes to robot manipulation, right? Or we think about much more, what is the input representation of the visual data that transfers at least more easily from sim to real, right? So for example, depth typically transfers much more easily than visual data, right? And so for grasping, for example, we encode a lot of it with point clouds that can be actually easily simulated. But yeah, it's like a big question on how to bridge that gap. And I would say, again, like on the real robot, we think much more algorithmically because there's not so much data. But then we also try to get source these videos basically that are out there. But I honestly, I still don't have the question. I don't have an answer on like how to bring these together. It's a very interesting question.
I'll ask a question from our virtual audience. This is about the last project that you described, the RSS submission. Mm-hmm. Could using a symbolic planner with some NLP to symbol pipeline do the same job as this LLM planner? Or is there something special here?
Yeah, if you had that translation, I guess that could work, right? So I think the special thing about LLMs is that you can be very broad, right? That you can even put objects. One thing that we could potentially do is, okay, you have this hook, but what if there's no hook in the environment? But maybe in that language model, you can actually, we found that in another project, that you can actually do generalization from a few examples. What is actually the category of these objects? So a hook could also be a rake, or it could be a fork or something. These are all similar objects that potentially could be used for this task, right? And that kind of common knowledge is encoded there, right? It still means like you have to do the hard part of actually executing on a robot with that new object, right? So that's, again, like still a limitation, but that kind of reasoning of grouping these objects together in terms of maybe functionality, that's something really interesting that these large language models bring that you then don't have to hand define, right? But yeah, maybe there's also a way to translate it to a PDDL domain, and then you can do symbolic task planning with guarantees, up to the fact that these LLMs may maybe make a wrong translation, of course. Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful work and the very, very clear talk. Very wonderful talk. Thank you. I poked at the bottom. Let me poke a little bit more at the top. Suppose instead of long horizon, suppose it was longer horizon. So that the red cup is blocking the shelf where the green cup is supposed to go, or the drawer is actually locked. And do you think that even equipped with the heavy artillery of LLMs that seem to know everything about everything, do you think that the combinatorial explosion is this approach going to extend to longer and longer horizons, or do you think you're going to need to bring new algorithmic reasoning, even way up as well as way down?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the bottleneck in this last approach is actually the TAPS part, where we do the planning, right? So we have to basically check the geometric feasibility over all of these possible skills that the LLM suggests. So that planning part is actually the bottleneck here. Now,
you're settling for
Mhm.
All yellow.
Yeah.
Thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's just generally a huge issue that I don't know how to get around. It's just a combinatorial problem. Like, is your question
The problems are
yes,
not really.
right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe 10. I don't know. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. But that's a very good question. So definitely there is a limit there, right? So and so first of all, like I come from a non-planning background. So my typical way of thinking is like planning, like don't plan too much, right? Because maybe that's like just like this is just like life advice, maybe in general, right? Like the pandemic happened, right? Like this is like the example where all your plans just everyone's plans just went straight out of the window, right? And so okay, that's you know, you can try to plan, but don't expect things to work out as you planned them, right? And that is true for life, and that is true for robots as well, right? So you just it doesn't make sense maybe to roll it out that long over like 100-dimensional case, right? Like in the end, you probably need to plan over some horizon, right? To solve these kinds of tasks that I showed. But in the end, you have to try. And then if you fail, you have to be able to understand it, right? Like this thing that you brought, like, oh, the drawer is locked, right? Like, okay, oh, well, I guess now I have to find the key, right? And that kind of reasoning, well, we haven't really thought about, but I almost feel like that kind of reasoning, that's maybe where an LMM can actually come in, right? Like, what does it mean if a drawer is locked? Like, I see you're not happy, like some of but yeah, yes, yeah, thank you.
All right, if you have more questions for Jeannette, she'll be at lunch, pizza
Yes.
following. We do not have a GRASS seminar next week because it's spring break. 2 weeks from now, on the 17th, it'll be Emilio Frizzoli. So come check that out. And let's thank Jeannette again for such a fantastic talk.